Hello and welcome to the Deception Tips podcast, where you will learn amazing cues to detect deceit that will help you read people like never before. I'm your host, Spencer Kaufman. Let's get started. Welcome to episode 59 of the Deception Tips podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm so excited you're here. Before we dive into this episode, again, we are going to recap what we talked about last week. Now, last week we spoke of something that is kind of important, and it's mainly prevalent on men more than women. That's because men have a larger Adam's apple. Now, when people lie, as we've talked about before, their mouth becomes dry. This leads to, obviously, their throat becoming dry, and a lot of different things that could happen because of that. Their voice may crack, which we talked about in episode 53. They may also lick their lips quite a bit, which we talked about in episode 32. Then there are other things that will happen that we kind of mentioned throughout those episodes, but we haven't had a full episode on them yet. But keep in mind that when people lie, they have this dry mouth. They have this, which then obviously they are not swallowing that saliva to moisten their throat. Therefore, their throat is dry. Now, when they speak, their voice may crack and stutter, and that Adam's apple may jump or move around irregularly. This is obviously due to the fact that they are not in normal functioning capacity. Why? Because they do not have a sufficient amount of moisture down there. Why is this? Why is their mouth dry? Well, as we've mentioned before, when people lie, there is a lot of stress and tension involved in telling that lie. That means when they're stressed and when they're tense, the body has different reactions. It has a fight or flight. Are you going to fight the enemy, or are you going to flee and run away? Hopefully you make the best decision for the situation, but what that means is when your body goes into that fight or flight, generally you are going to have less energy going towards the central processes of the body, things like digestion, production of saliva, etc., because most of the energy is going to go outward to your limbs, so you can either fight or run away. Therefore, the mouth becomes dry because you're not producing the saliva, and then that starts that chain reaction of all those symptoms that can occur because of that. Keep that in mind when you see these little symptoms and say, why is their mouth dry? Well, maybe they just had some kind of cinnamon or mustard powder or something that they ate, and now their mouth is dry. Or maybe they just had a bunch of French fries with no water. Or maybe they're on some kind of medication that causes dry mouth. Or it could be that they're lying. There could be any number of reasons. So pay attention to them and why they may be occurring. Today, we have another deception tip. This one piggybacks on quite a few that we've spoke of before. I won't get into them all now because it'll take too much time and I want to introduce it to you. But we've talked about it briefly 5 times before, at least. We've talked about it at least 5 times before. And it was mentioned, and also some of the tips that we've already had have played on this, as in they are a part of this, or they could be considered in a cluster or a pattern of behaviors that go along with these. So what is this behavior? Well, it goes on when people tend to kind of take up less space. So now we've talked about that one. That was back in episode 40 with taking up space. How when people lie, they tend to kind of curl up and take up less space so that obviously then there's less for other people to see. Remember, when you lie, everything is displayed on your body unconsciously. So the conscious may try to curl up to take up less space so that other people cannot read all of the leakage that the unconscious is doing. Whereas the unconscious says, all right, I'll let you curl up because I know that that's a form of leakage in and of itself. Because generally, most people do not curl up when they are speaking with someone. They tend to stand up and talk to them. So this one goes on curling up. So here it is. This is deception tip 59. Some people tend to pick up their legs and sit with them on the chair when they are being deceptive. Here it is again. Deception tip 59. Some people tend to pick up their legs and sit with them on the chair when they are being deceptive. So what does this mean? Well,
It's kind of complex, but it's really not. Some people tend to pick up their legs and sit with them on the chair. So what does it look like? Are they just sitting on top of their feet? Are they sitting on one leg? Are they curling up with their knees up to their chest, with their ankles right under their butt and kind of hugging their legs? Well, it could be any and all of those. Anytime someone is sitting with their feet up under them, it is a comfort gesture. Take a look when you invite guests over to your house. How are they sitting? Now, if it's a guy, typically he'll be sitting normally, with his feet on the floor. If he's a little bit more comfortable, he may even put his feet up or recline a little bit, slouch down, sink in. Take a look at the women. They're either in some form of rocking chair or hardback chair where they can just kind of sit and be rigid, so they're not comfortable because they're rigid, or they're sitting in a different chair and they usually have at least 1 foot under them. So they'll put 1 foot on the chair, sit on their foot, and kind of hunch up, whether they fold an arm in or something like that, or they'll be sitting with 2 feet under there. Why are they doing this? Because it's a comfort gesture. They're not yet fully comfortable at your house or wherever they are, so they're kind of giving themselves that little bit of a hug or that comfort, which we spoke of that way back in episode number 1, folding arms, that sometimes people may just be folding their arms to give themselves that hug feeling, that comfort gesture. So that's what it is. Pay attention to other people and see that. So it's not always a deceptive behavior when someone sits with their feet under them. It's a comfort gesture. So if they're uncomfortable, they may be doing that. So notice that, pay attention to that, and when you see it, you don't need to make a comment on it, but you could also do things that might help them make them more comfortable. Hey, if you need something, let me know, or feel free to help yourself. The kitchen's right over here. If you want, I'll show you where everything is. Don't be bashful. Kind of let them loosen up, open up a little bit, and see that. It's the little things that go a long way when trying to make someone feel a little bit more comfortable in their space or in that space. People tend to make ownership of that little space that they're in. So if it's a small little space, they're going to do things that make them feel comfortable at home. One little side note here is that the behavior of tapping one's foot or tapping their fingers, that is also a comfort. So like, let's say you're in your bedroom and something you typically do in your bedroom is you tap your fingers on your desk. Well, what are you going to do to make yourself feel a little bit more at home when you're in a foreign environment? You may tap your fingers to kind of jog that memory of being at home at your desk. Whether that's unconscious or conscious can be determined, but the point is that you will be doing those behaviors in the foreign environment in an attempt to make that environment feel a little bit more like yours. So before we continue, before we dive into this, I've got a story coming up for you. But before we do that, we got to take a little break, so it'll be coming up right after this.
Do you have a Facebook account? Of course you do. Like the Deception Tips Facebook page and participate in some online discussion, read more information, write a review, or simply say hello. Like the page today on Facebook.com/Deception Tips Spencer Kaufman.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about Deception Tip 59, which is all about how people tend to pick up their feet and sit with them on the chair when they are being deceptive. Now, I told you before we went to that little break that I had a story coming up for you. So here it is. I got a little story. I remember one time when I was in college, it was in a sociology class, and it was talking about male and female interactions and attraction and how to know whether or not someone likes you. Well, obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, you've got 59 little tips that will tell you whether or not someone is kind of liking you, but I've also talked a lot about attraction and about the little different things that can happen, such as the pupils, the breathing, the orientation of their body, space, etc. So here's another thing. One of the topics came up, and the teacher said, so guys, how do you know if the girl likes you? And I said, if she has her feet down. And everybody kind of laughed, but I was serious. When a girl puts her feet down, she's comfortable there. How do you know if she likes you? Well, if you meet her for the first time and you guys are together and she has her feet on the floor instead of curled up underneath her, she's more comfortable with you. That was my point there. Now, I don't think you want to take that as a solid chunk of gold, but you can take it and kind of put it in your repertoire with all of the other behaviors and say, hey, look, I'm hanging out with this person, It's a girl. She has her feet down. Her pupils are dilated. She's breathing. She's facing me. She's leaning towards me. She must like me. That kind of a thing. You can put that together with the cluster and pattern of behavior, because remember, it is so important to look for these clusters and patterns. Ladies, sorry. For guys, we pretty much always have our feet down or sprawled out, so you can take it to one further extreme. How do you know if the guy likes you? Well, he'll be more comfortable, natural, probably lay out a little bit more. The guys tend to take up a lot more space. We just do. We like to spread out. We like to extend our feet. We like to take over the little area we're in, whereas women are a little bit more quaint, whereas they want to just kind of sit in their spot and they don't want to impose. Guys kind of just, they don't have that courtesy or that consideration for the other space. Now, that's not a bad thing all the time, but it's something to be aware of. I'm not dogging anybody on guys or girls. I'm just stating what is the general truth. It's generally a stereotype. And if you want to label it like that, you can, because all of these behaviors then would generally be considered a stereotype. When someone lies, what is a stereotype? They do this, 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 and this. Well, it's not a stereotype, because a stereotype is kind of a false type of a belief, whereas this is something that happens. And generally, most of the stereotypes ended up coming from truth anyway, because if you examine them, a lot of them may be true, but that's a discussion for another time. So we've talked about picking up feet before. Where have we talked about it, and when? Let me give you a little recap. So we're going to go all the way back to episode number 1, when we talked about folding arms. When people fold their arms, there are a number of reasons. One of those reasons could be taking up less space, hiding their body, concealing their body, taking control of their hands, fingers, limbs, etc., covering up their chest area. That is preventing a lot of nonverbal communication from leaking. So that's kind of the concealment right there. We talked about it again in episode number 22 with locked ankles. They're concealing. They're locking those ankles. They're hiding in. They're tucking it. They're preventing the disclosure of other information. Then we talked about it again in episode 29, step backward. Well, when people step backward, they're trying to take up less space. They're retreating away. They're reducing the space they occupy. Then the big episode was number 40, where we said the title obviously was Take Up Space, if you remember. Hopefully you do. If you don't, go back and listen. Take Up Space, episode 40. This was where we talked about the entire thing of it, how when people are deceptive, they take up less space. Why? Because they're not as confident in what they're saying. Confident people tend to dominate the space they occupy. I've got a future tip, future podcast coming up. If you followed the blog or you've read the books, you know which tip it is, so I won't spoil it here. I encourage you to take a look, get a little prepared, do a little pre-study, kind of like your little homework assignment, if you will. Then we talked about it again in episode 56 with ankles backing away. Now, this was a combination of tucking the ankles, so kind of like the step backward, and also locking the ankles and pulling them back. In addition, it also combined the calf muscle at the X to kind of block off the perceptions. So they do that, they tuck it under, and they're kind of taking up less space. So picking up the legs is taking up less space, and it kind of hits on all of those that we talked about previously. So pay attention to this, because guys, it is important. When people are being deceptive, okay, there is a huge battle going on between the conscious and the unconscious minds. Now, they're the same brain. You have one brain in your head, one mind, at least we hope. That's sanity. Some people who have the multiple personality or split personality disorders, there's a new movie out called Split. Not a plug for them or anything, but pretty good movie that explains it. So the guy is just completely out there. He's got so many different personalities. There are a lot of case studies too. Sybil and all these people, I think it's called 49 or 47 or something. She had 49 different personalities. But either way, it is a real deal. So pay attention to that. This is what we're talking about. But when people are being deceptive, there is a huge battle going on. The conscious wants the lie to get away. They're self-serving. The unconscious wants the truth to get out. There's a fight. Pay attention to all of these unconscious behaviors. Make them a part of your conscious so that you will be able to read people and detect deception, so that you will know what's going on and you will know when someone is trying to pull the wool over your eyes, and it will never happen to you again because you will be able to see it and prevent it and call them on it. So I want to thank you for listening to the Deception Tips podcast. I hope that you'll share it with your friends, subscribe to the feed, watch the Deception Tips videos, check out the blog, and take a look at the books I have available. And as always, tune in next week for a new Deception Tip.